The will of the people now stands in opposition to the authority of the Senate.
Now you will learn what you were not taught in school history lessons. What if I told you that the powerful Roman Senate not only failed to stop the fall of the Republic, but also, step by step, handed over all power to one man, paving the way for the empire? This is not a story of a sudden coup, but of a slow, almost imperceptible decline, a series of fatal mistakes, personal ambitions, and laws that were supposed to save the Republic, but instead destroyed it. We will trace the entire path from the first cracks in the foundation to the complete collapse of a building that seemed eternal. Watch the video to the end to learn how the most powerful political body in the world signed its own death warrant and why the fall of the Republic was absolutely inevitable. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of Roman history. The Republic began to die long before Julius Caesar, and the first nail in its coffin was hammered in by the Senate itself. It all began in the 2nd century BC, when Rome faced an unexpected consequence of its own victories, a profound social crisis. While the legions were conquering new lands, wealthy aristocrats, taking advantage of the absence of small farmers, bought up their plots, creating huge estates, latifundia. Small landowners, the backbone of the Roman army and society, were ruined en masse, losing their land and becoming unemployed lumpen proletariat who flooded Rome. It was a time bomb at the very foundation of the state, because by law, only citizens who owned land could be drafted into the army. The Republic was rapidly losing its soldiers, and the capital was filling with an angry and impoverished crowd ready to follow anyone. It was at this moment that the tribune of the people, Tiberius Gracchus, who fully understood the depth of the problem, entered the scene. He proposed a simple and logical law to limit the maximum size of land ownership and redistribute surplus land among landless citizens. This step was intended to revive the class of small farmers, provide Rome with new soldiers, and reduce social tension in the capital. The Senate, consisting of the wealthiest landowners, perceived this initiative as a direct encroachment on their property and power. Instead of seeking a compromise and solving a national problem, the senators saw Gracchus as nothing more than a demagogue threatening their prosperity. They used all their influence to block his law, convincing another tribune to veto it. Faced with an impenetrable wall of senatorial opposition, Tiberius Gracchus took an unprecedented step. He removed the tribune who had vetoed the law from office by holding a vote in the People's Assembly. This was a direct violation of all political traditions. For the first time, the will of the people was placed above the unwritten rules and authority of the Senate. The senators were furious, accusing Gracchus of seeking tyranny. Tensions reached their peak when Tiberius decided to run for re-election as tribune the following year, which was also a violation of custom. During the vote, a group of senators and their supporters, armed with bench legs and clubs, stormed the square and staged a veritable bloodbath. Tiberius Gracchus and hundreds of his supporters were killed, and their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. This event became a point of no return in the history of the Republic. For the first time in hundreds of years, a political dispute within Rome was resolved not by negotiation and voting, but by brute force. Instead of solving a pressing social problem, the Senate showed that it was willing to resort to murder to protect its privileges, thus opening Pandora's box. 10 years later, Tiberius' brother Gaius Gracchus continued his work, proposing an even broader program of reforms. He not only returned to the land issue, but also attempted to limit corruption in the provinces and stabilize bread prices for the poor. Gaius was more cautious and intelligent than his brother and managed to pass several important laws. However, the Senate again saw him as a mortal threat to its position. A veritable information war was waged against Gaius Gracchus, and then, under the pretext of restoring order, the Senate issued an emergency decree for the first time in history, essentially declaring him an enemy of the state. Gaius Gracchus and several thousand of his supporters were destroyed, not by a mob, but by the forces of the official consular legions. Thus, the Senate made its first fatal mistake. By abandoning peaceful reforms and resorting twice to violence to eliminate political opponents, it showed all future, ambitious politicians a new path to power. a path where the army was more important than the law, and the will of one man could be placed above the will of the Senate. Do you think the Gracchi brothers had a real chance to reform the Republic peacefully, or did the Senate leave them no choice from the start? Share your thoughts in the comments. What if I told you that the army that conquered half the world for Rome ultimately became its gravedigger? After the tragedy of the Gracchi brothers, the land issue remained unresolved, and the Republic continued to suffer from a shortage of recruits. The crisis reached its peak at the end of the 2nd century BC, when hordes of Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons, descended on Rome from the north and inflicted several crushing defeats on the Roman legions. In this moment of despair, Rome turned to a new man, not an aristocrat, but a brilliant commander, Gaius Marius. He was elected consul several times in a row, which was a gross violation of the law. But the Senate was so frightened by the Germanic threat that it turned a blind eye. Marius understood that the old system of army recruitment would not win the war, and so he carried out a reform that changed the face of Rome forever. Marius abolished the property qualification and began to recruit all willing citizens into the legions, including the landless poor, the very proletarians for whom the Gracchi had fought. For these people, the army became not a civic duty, but a profession, the only chance to escape poverty. The state now fully provided soldiers with weapons, armor, and pay. The term of service was 16 years, after which a veteran could count on generous compensation. But the main thing that the commander promised his soldiers was land, a plot that they would receive after retirement and could cultivate for the rest of their lives. This reform had a tremendous effect. Marius created a professional, well-trained, and disciplined army that ultimately defeated the Germans and saved Rome. The legions became the most effective fighting force in the ancient world. But this power came at a terrible price. The problem was that it was now the general, not the Senate or the state, who guaranteed veterans land. Soldiers began to see their commander as their only protector and benefactor. Their loyalty shifted from the abstract idea of the Republic to the specific person who led them into battle, shared the spoils with them, and promised them a secure old age. The legions essentially became the private armies of their generals. The legion's banner, its eagle, became more sacred to the soldiers than the laws of Rome. They were ready to carry out any order from their commander, even if that order was directed against Rome itself. The Senate watched this process with concern, but could do nothing about it. On the one hand, these new armies were necessary to defend and expand the borders of the empire. On the other hand, every successful commander who returned to Rome at the head of legions loyal to him became a potential threat to the power of the senators. The Senate's attempts to block the allocation of land to the veterans of a particular commander only exacerbated the situation. This led to riots and further bound the soldiers to their leader. The generals understood that the only way to fulfill the promises made to their people was to force the necessary decision through the Senate. Thus, the reform, designed to save Rome from external threats, gave rise to a deadly internal threat. It created a tool with which any ambitious and popular general could challenge the authority of the Senate. And very soon a man appeared who decided to use this tool not for defense, but to seize Rome. Do you think Rome could have continued its expansion without reforming the army? Or were Marius' reforms a necessary evil? But the creation of a professional army was only the first step. In the next chapter, you will learn how one man used this new army to capture Rome itself for the first time in history and write a bloody script for all future dictators. What I am about to show you was a real scenario of seizing power, which Julius Caesar later simply copied, but in an even more brutal way. This man was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a talented commander of aristocratic origin who once served under Marius himself. Fate brought them together in a deadly struggle for power that ultimately destroyed the old Republican foundations. The conflict began over command of a lucrative war against the Pontic king Mithridates. The Senate entrusted this war to Sulla, but Marius, using his supporters in the People's Assembly, took command away from him. This was a humiliation that Sulla, who was at the head of his legions ready for campaign, could not bear. And then Sulla did the unthinkable, something that no one in the history of Rome had ever dared to do before. He turned to his soldiers and convinced them that their enemy was not in the east, but in Rome itself. He deployed 6 legions loyal to him personally and led them to the sacred city, violating all divine and human laws. Rome was unprepared for such treachery. The city was taken by storm, and Sulla led his troops into the capital for the first time in history. Marius and his supporters fled, and Sulla, having passed the laws he needed, went to war with Mithridates, leaving Rome under the control of his consuls. However, as soon as Sulla left, the Marians returned and unleashed a reign of terror in Rome, destroying all of Sulla's supporters. Upon learning of this, Sulla hastily concluded peace with Mithridates and returned to Italy. The first full-scale civil war in Roman history began, flooding the entire country with blood. Sulla's army, hardened in battles in the east, won one victory after another. The decisive battle took place at the gates of Rome itself, at the Colline Gate, where Sulla completely destroyed the last forces of the Marians. He became the absolute ruler of Rome and the entire Republic. To get rid of all his remaining enemies and consolidate his power, Sulla resorted to a new, monstrous invention: proscription. These were lists of people who had been declared outlaws. Anyone could kill a person on the list and receive a reward for doing so, and their property was confiscated by the state. Proscriptions turned into a wave of legalized murder and looting that destroyed thousands of senators, equestrians, and simply wealthy citizens. Having eliminated all his opponents, Sulla forced the intimidated and depleted Senate to appoint him dictator, not for the usual 6 months, but for an indefinite term, with the right to enact and repeal any laws. He gained absolute monarchical power that no one before him had ever had. His will became above any law or decree of the Senate. Paradoxically, Sulla used his unlimited power to strengthen the Republic and the power of the Senate, as he believed. He carried out a series of reforms that increased the number of senators, limited the power of the tribunes of the people, and made it more difficult for commanders to keep the army under their command for long. He sincerely believed that he could return the Republic to a golden age, but Sulla's most shocking act came at the end. After serving as dictator for about 2 years, he voluntarily relinquished all his powers, dismissed his bodyguards, and retired to private life on his estate. He died a year later of illness, remembered in history as both a bloody tyrant and a man who tried to save the Republic. However, his legacy was terrible. Sulla set a precedent. He clearly showed that a loyal army allows one to capture Rome, destroy all enemies, and gain absolute power. He wrote a step-by-step guide for future dictators, and among the young people who watched his bloody deeds with horror was Gaius Marius' nephew, who miraculously managed to escape proscription. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Are you ready to learn the truth about how the Senate went from being the highest authority to a mere puppet in the hands of a few oligarchs? Sulla's lesson was well learned by the new generation of Roman politicians. They understood that real power now lay not in the authority of the Senate, but in control of the legions and the support of the people, which could be bought with money. After Sulla's death, 2 new figures rose to prominence in the political arena of Rome. The first was Gnaeus Pompeius, a talented military commander who achieved fame by suppressing a rebellion in Spain and destroying pirates in the Mediterranean. The second was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, who had amassed his fortune during the time of Sulla's proscriptions. Both Pompey and Crassus despised each other, but were forced to form an alliance in order to achieve the consulship. The Senate, fearing their combined power, gave in. It became clear that the old system no longer worked, and that 2 strong players could easily dictate their will to the aristocracy. However, a third player soon entered the scene, one who surpassed them both in cunning and ambition: Gaius Julius Caesar. He came from a noble but impoverished family, was related to Marius, and nearly died under Sulla. Caesar did not have Pompey's huge army or Crassus's untold riches, but he had a brilliant political mind and incredible popularity among the Roman plebs. Caesar realized that he could not reach the pinnacle of power alone. And then he made a brilliant move. He reconciled his 2 main rivals, Pompey and Crassus, and convinced them to form a secret political alliance. This alliance, which went down in history as the first triumvirate, was an informal agreement between the three most influential men in Rome to act together, supporting each other and ignoring the will of the Senate. The essence of this alliance was simple. Caesar, using his popularity, was to become consul and pass the laws that Pompey and Crassus needed. Pompey wanted the Senate to approve his orders in the east and allocate land to his veterans. Crassus, representing the interests of wealthy equestrians, needed to revise contracts in Asia that were unfavorable to them. The Senate stubbornly refused to comply with the demands of Pompey and Crassus. But with Caesar's election as consul, the situation changed. Acting in the interests of the triumvirate, Caesar, faced with opposition from his fellow consul and the Senate, simply ignored them and passed all the necessary laws directly through the People's Assembly, sometimes resorting to outright violence on the part of his supporters. The Senate found itself in a humiliating position. It no longer controlled the situation in the state, but only watched helplessly as three men disposed of the fate of the Republic in their own interests. Power had fled from the Curia's meeting hall to the streets of Rome and the headquarters of the legions. As a reward for his work, Caesar secured himself an appointment as governor of Gaul for a full 5 years. This gave him what he did not have: the opportunity to raise his own army and win military glory comparable to that of Pompey. The senators, who hated and feared Caesar, were happy to get rid of him, at least for a while, not realizing that they were sending him to the forge of his future power. The triumvirate clearly demonstrated the complete powerlessness of the Senate. As long as the triumvirs acted together, they could push through any decision. The Republic was de facto ruled not by legitimate magistrates, but by a shadow government of three oligarchs, each pursuing their own goals. But what happens when such an alliance breaks down? None of its members want to return to the old system and submit to the Senate. A struggle begins, not for influence, but for sole power, and the Senate is reduced to the role of a spectator, forced to bet on one of the players. Want to know how this game led to the most famous civil war in history? The triumvirate, based on a precarious balance of interests, could not last forever. Its first loss was Crassus, who, in pursuit of military glory, embarked on an adventurous campaign against the Parthian Empire. His army was defeated, and he himself was killed, leaving Caesar and Pompey alone. While Caesar waged a brilliant and bloody Gallic war for almost 10 years, his position in Rome was changing. He conquered vast territories, seized untold riches, and created a battle-hardened army fanatically loyal to him. From being a popular politician, he became the most successful and dangerous commander in Roman history. During this time, Pompey remained in Rome, gradually becoming closer to the senatorial aristocracy. The senators, who were mortally afraid of Caesar's growing power, saw Pompey as their protector, the lesser of two evils. They granted him extraordinary powers to restore order in Rome, effectively making him the sole leader, but without an army. Pompey, who envied Caesar's fame and feared his return, willingly entered into this alliance with the Senate. The fragile alliance between the last two triumvirs finally collapsed. Conflict became inevitable, and both sides began to prepare for a decisive battle. Caesar's term of office in Gaul was coming to an end. By law, in order to run for consul, he had to disband his army and enter Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar understood perfectly well that as soon as he was left without his legions, his political enemies in the Senate would immediately bring him to trial on trumped-up charges and destroy him. Caesar tried to negotiate, offering a compromise. He and Pompey would relinquish their commands at the same time. But his enemies in the Senate, urged on by Pompey, took an uncompromising stance. They passed an ultimatum through the Senate. Caesar must immediately disband his army and return to Rome. Otherwise, he would be declared an enemy of the state. This was a direct challenge. The Senate, confident of the support of Pompey and his legions stationed in Spain, decided to escalate the situation. The tribunes of the people, who tried to veto this decision, were expelled from the Senate and fled north to Caesar's camp. Caesar was faced with a fateful choice: to obey, which meant political and possibly physical death for him, or to go against the will of the Senate and start a civil war. In January 49 BC, at the head of his famous Einarthorn Legion, he approached the small river Rubicon, which separated his province of Gaul from Italy. Crossing this river with his army was, by law, an act of treason. According to legend, It was here that Caesar uttered his famous phrase, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. With this step, he placed his personal loyal army above the law and the authority of the Senate, starting the last civil war of the Republic. The Senate and Pompey were completely unprepared for such a swiftness. They expected Caesar to hesitate, but he moved with lightning speed, capturing one Italian city after another without a fight. Pompey had no troops in Italy and was forced, along with most of the senators, to flee Rome in disgrace to the Balkans to raise an army. Caesar entered the capital without a single shot being fired, becoming its absolute ruler. The Senate's inability to find a political compromise and its reliance on one strong man against another led to it losing everything: the capital, its authority, and control over the situation. The Republic was finally plunged into the chaos of civil war from which it would never emerge the same. What if I showed you a time machine? The civil war between Caesar and Pompey was a war between two worlds. Pompey had the legitimate authority of the Senate, the vast resources of the eastern provinces, and numerical superiority in his armies. Caesar had the iron legions of veterans of the Gallic War, military genius, and the unwavering faith of his soldiers in their leader. In a series of brilliant battles, the most famous of which was the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar, despite being outnumbered, completely defeated Pompey's armies. Pompey himself fled to Egypt, where he was treacherously murdered. It took Caesar several more years to destroy the remaining pockets of Pompeian resistance in Africa and Spain. Returning to Rome in 45 BC after his final victory, Caesar found himself in a unique position. He was the absolute ruler of the entire Roman Empire, with no serious rivals. All military and political power was concentrated in his hands. Now he faced the most difficult task: how to legalize this power and rule a huge state while formally remaining within the framework of republican traditions. He could not simply declare himself king. The Romans hated that word. He had to find a new form of government. Caesar began to accumulate key republican positions in his hands. He was elected consul several times in a row, and then appointed dictator, first for a year, then for 10 years. Finally, in 44 BC, the Senate awarded him the title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. In addition to dictatorship, he received the lifetime powers of a tribune of the people, which made him sacred and inviolable, and gave him the right to veto any decision. He received the title of Father of the Fatherland and the right to speak first in the Senate. In essence, he possessed the full power of a king, but under the guise of old republican titles. The Senate, which Caesar filled with his supporters, including former centurions and even noble Gauls, became an obedient instrument of his will. Senators competed with each other in flattery, showering Caesar with more and more honors. They minted his image on coins, which was previously unthinkable for a living person, and even renamed the month of his birth July. At the same time, Caesar launched a vigorous reform program. He reformed the calendar, which we still use today, began large-scale construction projects in Rome, distributed land to his veterans and landless citizens, and founded new colonies. He tried to solve the very problems that had led the Republic into crisis. However, his position became increasingly ambiguous. Outwardly, he behaved as first among equals, but his real power was absolute. Republican-minded aristocrats saw him with horror as a monarch who had destroyed their freedom and turned the Senate into a mere decoration. Caesar himself did not seem to fully understand how to get out of this situation. He refused the royal diadem offered to him, but at the same time behaved like an autocrat. This uncertainty, this suspension between republic and monarchy, gave rise to a conspiracy that, according to its participants, was supposed to save Rome. Could Caesar have found a way to retain his power without destroying the appearance of the republic? Or was his path inevitably leading to monarchy? In the next chapter, you will learn why the murder of one man not only failed to save the republic, but plunged it into an even more terrible and bloody war.
Caesar's ambition threatens everything we hold dear. We must act to save the Republic.
But how can we move
Among the senators favored by Caesar, there were many who secretly hated him and considered him a tyrant. These were representatives of the old aristocracy who sincerely believed in republican ideals. They saw the cause of their ancestors dying before their eyes and considered it their duty to stop this process at any cost. Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus led the conspiracy. The latter was a particularly significant figure. He was considered a descendant of the very Brutus who had expelled the last king from Rome. Marcus Brutus's participation gave the conspiracy an ideological slant. It was not a struggle for power, but a struggle for freedom against tyranny. The conspirators believed in a naive idea. Once the tyrant was removed, the Republic would miraculously restore itself. They thought that by killing Caesar, they would restore the Senate to its former glory and power. They did not understand that Caesar was not the cause of the disease, but only its most striking symptom. The moment for the assassination was not chosen at random. Caesar was about to embark on a great campaign against Parthia to avenge Crassus's defeat. The conspirators feared that after another victorious war, his power would become absolutely unchallenged, and he might be proclaimed king. On March 15th, 44 BC, on the day of the Ides of March, the conspirators carried out their plan. During a Senate meeting held in Pompey's theater, they surrounded Caesar and stabbed him 23 times with daggers. Seeing Brutus, whom he considered his friend, among the assassins, Caesar, according to legend, said, "You too, my child," and then stopped resisting. After committing the murder, the conspirators, who called themselves liberators, ran out into the forum with their bloody daggers, proclaiming the restoration of freedom. However, a bitter disappointment awaited them. The Roman people, who adored Caesar for his generosity and victories, did not support them. The crowd greeted them with deathly silence. Moreover, the liberators had no clear plan for further action. They had killed the dictator, but did not know what to do with his legacy, his laws, his army, and his supporters. They found themselves in a political vacuum, with neither real military power nor the support of the population. Power in the city quickly passed into the hands of Caesar's loyal ally, the consul Mark Antony. At Caesar's funeral, Antony delivered a fiery speech, showing the crowd the dictator's blood-stained toga and reading his will. In it, Caesar left a small amount of money to every Roman citizen, which sparked an explosion of popular anger against the conspirators. Brutus, Cassius, and the other liberators had to flee Rome. Instead of restoring the Republic, they provoked a struggle for Caesar's inheritance. The murder of one man did not solve any of the problems, but only created a power vacuum, which new, even more ruthless predators immediately rushed to fill. Caesar's assassination did not return power to the Senate, but gave free rein to two leading Caesarians, the experienced commander and consul Mark Antony, and an unknown 18-year-old youth. This young man was Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew, whom the dictator had adopted in his will and made his chief heir. Upon accepting the adoption, he became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavian. At first, no one took Octavian seriously. However, the young man showed a political mind and iron will beyond his years. Relying on the name of his adoptive father and his money, he quickly assembled an army of Caesar's veterans, becoming an independent political force. At first, Octavian even formed an alliance with the Senate against Antony, who was trying to seize sole power. However, after winning, he realized that the Senate was simply using him as a temporary tool. Octavian then took a decisive step. He formed an alliance with his recent enemy Antony and another Caesarian, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Unlike the first alliance, this one was formalized and called the Second Triumvirate. The triumvirs were granted extraordinary powers for 5 years to manage state affairs. In fact, it was a legalized collective dictatorship of 3 people who divided the entire Roman Empire among themselves. The first thing the triumvirs decided to do was to avenge Caesar's death and replenish their coffers. They revived Sulla's most terrible invention, prescription. The new lists were even more extensive and cruel. They included hundreds of senators and thousands of equestrians, not only enemies of the Caesarians, but also simply wealthy people. The greatest orator of Rome, Cicero, who had spoken out fiercely against Antony in his speeches, also fell victim to the prescriptions. The Senate was decapitated, intimidated, and finally deprived of any political will. Those who were not killed either fled to the east to Brutus and Cassius or swore allegiance to the triumvirs. Having assembled a huge army, Antony and Octavian crossed over to Greece, where they defeated the last defenders of the Republic in the Battle of Philippi. Brutus and Cassius, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, committed suicide. With their deaths, the very idea of restoring the old Republic died. After their victory, the triumvirs divided up the world. Octavian received Italy, which was complex and ravaged by war, and the western provinces. Antony took the rich and peaceful east, while Lepidus received Africa. From the outset, this division contained the seeds of a new conflict. While Octavian struggled to solve problems in Italy, granting land to hundreds of thousands of veterans, Antony enjoyed luxury and power in the east. It was there that he met the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra. The Senate no longer played any role in this new reality. It merely formally approved the decisions of the triumvirate. The Republic had finally become a fiction, behind which three military dictators divided the world among themselves, preparing for the final, decisive battle. After the defeat of the Republicans, Octavian and Antony remained the only real players on the political scene. Lepidus, the third member of the triumvirate, was quickly pushed into the background and stripped of his power. The final clash between Caesar's two heirs was only a matter of time. Antony, who was in the east, fell increasingly under Cleopatra's influence. Their alliance was not only romantic, but also political. Antony needed Egypt's money to maintain his huge army, and Cleopatra dreamed of reviving the greatness of the Ptolemaic Empire with the help of the Roman commander. Antony behaved in the east like a Hellenistic monarch rather than a Roman magistrate. He distributed Roman provinces to his children by Cleopatra, staged lavish triumphs in Alexandria rather than Rome, and increasingly distanced himself from Roman traditions. This was a real gift for his rival. Octavian behaved quite differently in Rome. He positioned himself as a defender of Roman values and traditions, as a modest and hard-working leader rebuilding the state after decades of civil war. He launched a powerful propaganda campaign against Antony. In the eyes of the Romans, Octavian portrayed Antony as a man who had lost his head over his love for an Eastern harlot, as a traitor who was ready to give Roman lands to a foreign queen. The propaganda worked flawlessly. Public opinion in Italy increasingly leaned toward Octavian. The campaign culminated in the reading of Antony's will in the Senate. In it, Antony not only recognized Cleopatra's children as his heirs, but also asked to be buried in Alexandria. For the Romans, this was the last straw, proof that Antony had finally broken with Rome. Octavian got the Senate to officially declare war, not on Antony, so it wouldn't look like another civil war, but on Cleopatra. This way, he presented the conflict not as an internal power struggle, but as a holy war of Italy in the west against the threat from the east. The decisive battle took place in 31 BC at Cape Actium in Greece. It was a naval battle in which Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant admiral Marcus Agrippa, completely defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Seeing defeat inevitable, Cleopatra fled with her squadron, while Antony abandoned the remnants of his fleet and army and followed her. This defeat was the end for them. Returning to Egypt, they found themselves completely isolated. When Octavian's legions entered Alexandria, Antony, and then Cleopatra committed suicide. Octavian became the sole ruler of the entire Roman world. The last civil war of the Republic was over. After nearly a century of continuous upheaval, rebellions, and wars, long-awaited peace had arrived. But the price of that peace was high. It was the death of the Republic.
I am relinquishing all of my extraordinary...
In 27 BC, Octavian, returning to Rome after his final victory, made a brilliant political move. He appeared at a meeting of the Senate and solemnly announced that he was relinquishing all his extraordinary powers and returning the Republic to the control of the Senate and the people of Rome. It was a performance designed to show that he did not intend to follow in Caesar's footsteps. The grateful senators, tired of war and thirsting for stability, begged him not to leave the state. They gave him the honorary name Augustus, which means exalted by the gods. Thus was born a new political regime, which we call the Empire, but which Augustus himself modestly called the restored Republic. The essence of this regime, called the Principate, was a brilliant illusion. Formally, all republican institutions, the Senate, consuls, popular assemblies, were preserved and continued to function. But real power was quietly concentrated in the hands of one man, the princeps, the first citizen, who was Augustus. How did he achieve this? Augustus did not declare himself a dictator or a king. Instead, he was regularly elected consul and also received the powers of a tribune for life, which gave him the right of veto and made him sacred. But the main source of his power was his command of the army. Augustus kept all the most important border provinces, where most of the legions were stationed, under his personal control. The Senate was left with the peaceful and safe interior provinces without serious troops. Thus, Augustus controlled all the military power of the state. All the legions now swore allegiance to him personally, not to the Senate. He became the only commander who could celebrate triumphs, and his legates fought on his behalf. He also controlled finances by creating a separate imperial treasury, which was replenished by revenues from his provinces in Egypt, which became his personal property. This allowed him to pay soldiers' salaries and finance any projects without asking the Senate for permission. The Senate, meanwhile, became an honorary but largely decorative body. It still consisted of the most noble and wealthy people in Rome, governed some provinces, and even minted copper coins. But it completely lost control over the army and foreign policy. That is, it lost its real levers of power. Augustus ruled for almost 40 years, and during that time his system became established and accepted. The Romans, exhausted by a century of civil wars, gladly exchanged their turbulent and dangerous freedom for the peace, order, and stability that the new regime brought them. The idea that it was possible to return to the old republic died with the last generation of its defenders. The Senate was unable to stop this process because it had paved the way for it with its own mistakes. By rejecting the reforms of the Gracchi, it gave rise to political violence. By accepting Marius' reform, it allowed the creation of private armies. By backing Pompey against Caesar and then Octavian against Antony, it repeatedly placed its bets on a single leader, thereby weakening itself. As a result, it turned into a club of aristocrats who could only approve the decisions of the man who held real power, the army. We have come a long and tragic way from the first reforms of the Gracchi brothers to the establishment of Augustus's power. This story shows that the fall of the Roman Republic was not the result of the actions of one man, whether Caesar or Octavian. It was a long process of disintegration caused by deep social contradictions that the Senate was unable or unwilling to resolve. Every step that was supposed to strengthen the Republic actually brought it closer to its end. The attempt to preserve the privileges of the aristocracy led to violence. The creation of an effective army gave rise to the threat of military coups. The assassination of the dictator only led to an even more terrible tyranny. Ultimately, the Roman Empire was born not because someone wanted to create it, but because the old republican system simply ceased to function in the context of a huge world power. It could not cope with the administration of the provinces, the problem of a professional army, or the ambitions of its own commanders. The illusion of the republic created by Augustus turned out to be the only form in which this state could continue to exist, ensuring it several more centuries of peace and prosperity. Do you think the Senate had even one real chance during that century to stop the decline of the Republic? And if so, at what point? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.